The nave of the Gloriana Invictus, flagship of the questing crusade of House Hyperion, was a cathedral to war made manifest. Its vaulted ceilings soared into darkness, hundreds of meters high, held aloft by buttresses carved in the likeness of the Primarch Rogel Dorn, a tribute to the vessel's ancient provenance. Stained glass windows, each the size of a hab block, depicted the glorious history of the house, the founding on their homeworld of Hyperia, the taming of the iron worms, the stand at the Crimson Gate against the arch-heretics' hordes. The air itself was thick with the scent of sanctified machine oil, ozone from potent generators, and the cold, sharp tang of recycled air, common to all void-faring vessels. Yet here it felt less like a necessity and more like a hallowed incense. Upon the marble floor, polished to a mirror sheen that reflected the glories above, stood the silent, magnificent forms of knight paladins and armigers, their heraldry a riot of gold, cobalt, and crimson, each a silent testament to 10,000 years of unswerving loyalty. At the hall's terminus upon the throne of the High King sat Arator the Valiant. He was a monument in his own right, his age belied by the augmetic strength of his frame and the fierce, unwavering light in his eyes. His face was a mask of noble severity, etched with the cares of command, framed by a mane of silver hair. He wore not the robes of a planetary governor, but the fitted black carapace of a princeps, its surface gleaming under the lumen globes. His gaze was fixed upon the great archway at the far end of the nave, the entrance to the sanctum of celestial cartomancy, wherein the fate of their holy endeavor was being decided. For 3 centuries, the fleet of House Hyperion had journeyed through the void. They had left their verdant homeworld behind, entrusting it to a skeleton garrison in the faith of their people, to embark upon the Gilded Quest. Their purpose was a mandate, spoken of only in the most reverent tones, to follow the Emperor's unspoken will, guided by the divine computations of their Sacristans, and to bring his light to the dark corners of the galaxy. They were a self-contained world of warriors, artisans, and servitors, a mobile fortress principality adrift on the cosmic tides, their faith their only true chart. The great bronze doors of the sanctum groaned open, the sound echoing through the cavernous hall like the first note of a somber hymn. From the swirling mists of cryogenic coolant and vaporized sacred unguents emerged the procession of the Adeptus Mechanicus, their red robes a stark contrast to the knight's finery. At their head was High Sacristan Ordinatus Kalen. Kalen was more machine than man, a grotesque yet awe-inspiring fusion of ancient flesh and esoteric technology. His original face was long gone, replaced by a polished brass servo skull from which a multitude of mechadendrites and optical sensors sprouted, twitching and whirring as they sampled the environment. His voice, when it came to it, was not born of a human throat, but from a trio of voxcasters welded to his chest, a perfect uninflected trinity of sound. There was a time when the Sacristans of Hyperion were men of flesh, their knowledge passed from master to apprentice. But centuries of adherence to the cult Mechanicus had changed them. Kalen was the apex of this evolution, a being who communed directly with the core cogitator of the sanctum, the ancient and holy machine that interpreted the will of the Omnissiah from the chaotic static of the cosmos. No one questioned his pronouncements, for his calculations were said to be so complex, so divinely inspired that they bordered on prophecy. Unseen by any deep within the marrow of Kalen's remaining bones and etched into the subroutines of his cortex implants lay the microscopic crystalline scars of homunculi artistry, a corruption so subtle and ancient it had become part of his very being. The whisper in his data stream was not the voice of the machine god, but the patient, venomous murmur of Archon Vresk Maladrak, of the cabal of the flayed iris. High King Arator, Kalen's synthesized voices chorused, each syllable precise and devoid of emotion. The Omnissiah has granted us a sign. The pattern engines have aligned. The celestial orae has found its focus. The barons and princeps of the household, assembled before the throne, stirred. A low murmur of anticipation rippled through the nave. Arator leaned forward, his gauntleted hands gripping the arms of his throne. Speak, High Sacristan, where does the Emperor's light guide our righteous fury now? A massive hololith, 100 meters wide, shimmered into existence above the assembled nobles, projecting a swirling map of the segmentum tempestus. Kalen extended a gleaming pincer arm, and the star chart zoomed with dizzying speed into an obscure, ill-charted region on the fringe of imperial space. It was a cluster of stars marked only by dire warnings and designations of Xenos infestation. "Behold," Kalen intoned, his optical sensors glowing with a fervent red light, "the Somnus stars, a blight upon the Emperor's domain. For millennia it has festered, a haven for the greenskin, the renegade, and the lost. Our augurs, guided by the most sacred of algorithms, have discerned a confluence of fate within this sector. A great evil coalesces, a shadow that threatens to spread and consume." The hololith resolved further, showing representations of brutish orc vessels, crude orbital stations, and worlds scarred by endemic warfare. The data was perfect, meticulously compiled, and utterly convincing. It presented a clear and present danger, a challenge worthy of a knightly house's might. It was also a carefully constructed lie, fed piece by piece into the sanctum's cogitators over decades by the Archon's agents, painting a picture of a rising threat where there was only disorganized squalor, ripe for the reaping. "The divinations are unequivocal," Kalen continued, his voice rising in a semblance of mechanical fervor. "The Gilded Quest demands we divert our course. We must be the Emperor's scalpel to this cancerous growth. We must scour the Somnus stars with holy fire and bless its worlds with the purity of the void. It is a war worthy of our oaths, a crusade that will be sung of for 1,000 years." High King Erator rose from his throne, his sheer presence silencing the hall. He looked at the hololith, his eyes tracing the path of conquest laid out before them. He saw a righteous war, a chance to bring glory to his house and deliverance to a forgotten corner of the galaxy. He saw honor. He saw duty. He did not see the subtle web of deceit that enveloped them all, nor the hungry, gloating eyes that watched from the dark city of Kamarach, seeing not knights but shepherds, expertly guiding their flock to the slaughterhouse. "Barons of Hyperion, princeps of the quest," Erator's voice boomed, amplified by the throne's vox emitter. "You have heard the word of the Omnissiah, interpreted by our faithful Sacristan. A shadow looms, and we are the light that shall banish it. Ready your engines of war. Prepare your lances and your cannons. We ride to the Somnus stars, and we shall leave nothing in our wake but the ashes of the unclean and the glorious testament of our faith." A thunderous roar of ascent shook the nave. Metal gauntlets hammered against ceramite chests, the sound a promise of the violence to come. The decision was made that the course was set. The great fleet of House Hyperion, a shining beacon of imperial nobility and martial power, began its slow, inexorable turn toward the benighted sector that would become its crucible and its tomb, every soul aboard utterly convinced of the sanctity of their mission, blind to the fact they had just become the vanguard for the greatest act of mass soul theft the galaxy had ever known. The transition from the ordered star lanes of the Segmentum Tempestus into the Somnus stars was like passing from a manicured temple garden into a corpse-choked charnel pit. The very light of the stars seemed different here, sicklier, filtered through vast nebulae of rust-colored dust and shimmering with the radiation of unstable, dying suns. Imperial charts were useless. The region was a navigational nightmare, a maelstrom of uncharted gravitic tides, asteroid fields thick as winter forests, and rogue planetoids careening on mad, unpredictable orbits. To the nobles of House Hyperion, this chaos was not a deterrent, but a confirmation. Such cosmic anarchy was the perfect breeding ground for the filth they had come to purge. Their fleet, a spearhead of imperial order led by the Gloriana Invictus, pushed into the sector's blighted heart, its augur arrays peeling back the shroud of neglect and decay. Their first contact was with the so-called Iron Fang Flotilla, a pirate fleet under the command of a hulking orc war boss known as Grokhart de Tintouf. The Iron Fang was a grotesque mockery of a naval force, a collection of dozens of kill cruisers and rocks, each a barely contained explosion of scrap metal belching flame and unshielded reactors. They swarmed towards the Hyperion fleet with a suicidal bravado, their communications channels a screaming bedlam of war cries and guttural threats. High King Erator watched the engagement from the command throne of the Invictus, his face an impassive mask of contempt. He gave a single curt nod to his flag captain. The response was not a conversation, but a judgment. The Nova cannon of the Invictus fired first. A sun-hot orb of plasma traversed the void in an instant, striking the lead cruiser. The orc vessel did not simply explode. It was annihilated, its constituent atoms blasted apart in a silent, blinding flash of pure energy that momentarily outshone the sector's baleful stars. Before the light had even faded, the lances of the escorting cruisers stitched lines of incandescent fury across the void, gutting orc ships from stem to stern. Broadside after broadside of macro-cannon shells, each the size of a municipal tower, followed, turning the ramshackle armada into a rapidly expanding cloud of shrapnel and frozen orc blood. The battle in the void was over in less than an hour. It was not a contest of arms. It was an execution on a planetary scale. Their target was the orcs' primary stronghold in the system, the scrap world of Scraphold. It was a terrestrial planet that had been encased over millennia in the wreckage of defeated ships, failed inventions, and the general detritus of a profoundly wasteful and violent culture. Continents were buried under mountains of rusting metal, and oceans of toxic sludge filled the craters left by crashed rocks. From this metallic husk, crude fortresses bristled with oversized, inaccurate cannons. Their gun maws pointed defiantly at the heavens, the Knights of House. Hyperion made planetfall not in precise tactical drops, but as a single overwhelming wave of divine retribution. From the cavernous holds of 100 landers, the adamantium behemoths descended, their stabilizer jets scorching the metallic plains. Phalanxes of knights, from the versatile paladins and crusaders to the immense indomitable forms of the Castellan and Valiant chassis, formed up on the surface. Alongside them, packs of lithe armiger warglaves and helverins loped forward, their engines whining like hungry predators. It was a steel tide, an army of walking gods arrayed against a culture of primitives who worshipped brute force. They were about to receive a masterclass in its application. High King Erator, piloting his own Night Warden, the Oathkeeper, gave the order. For the glory of the house, for the honor of Terra, advance and cleanse. The charge of House Hyperion was a sight of terrible, beautiful violence. The very ground, a compressed strata of ancient battlefields, buckled and groaned under the weight of their advance. A cacophony of war horns blared from the vox emitters of each knight, a sound that drowned out the orcs' own defiant roars. The greenskins' defense was immediate and mindlessly ferocious. A literal ocean of ordnance, shells, rockets, and sizzling energy bolts spewed from their fortress walls, a storm of metal that would have obliterated any lesser army. It broke against the iron shields of the knights like a spring shower against a cliff face. Shimmering domes of azure energy flared into life around each walker, deflecting the fusillade with contemptuous ease. Then the knights returned fire. Thermal cannons fired in unison, their white-hot beams turning entire sections of the scrap fortresses into molten slag. Avenger Gatling cannons spun up to speed, unleashing a hailstorm of mass reactive shells that shredded orc war machines and flesh with equal indiscriminate efficiency. Rocket pods streaked skyward, arcing down to shatter gun emplacements and obliterate mobs of charging boys. It was a perfectly choreographed symphony of destruction. When they reached the fortress walls, the true slaughter began. Reaper chainswords, their teeth the size of grown men, revved with a deafening shriek before biting into the crude plating of the orc fortifications, peeling them open like tin cans. Thunderstrike gauntlets, crackling with disruptive energy fields, punched through ferrocrete bunkers, causing them to implode in on themselves. Knight errants and gallants, built for the glorious brutality of close combat, plunged into the heart of the orc defenders. They were avatars of the Emperor's wrath, their every step crushing a dozen greenskins, their every swing of their colossal weapons scything through ranks of knobs and flashgits. The orcs fought back with the courage of beasts, their crude choppas and shooters all but useless against the knights' thick adamantium hides. Stompas and Gorkanauts, the orcs' own lumbering war engines, lumbered forward to meet the challenge, only to be systematically dismantled by focused fire or toppled in duels that were laughably one-sided. The fight for Scraphold lasted a full terrestrial day, and by its end the planet was silent. The knights stood victorious amidst a wasteland of their own making, their gilded hulls splattered with the green and black gore of the Xenos. They had not sustained a single casualty among their nobles. This pattern was repeated across the Somnus stars. From the spore-choked fungal swamps of Grotmire to the smoke-belching factory hives of Mecha Prime, House Hyperion was unstoppable. They were a force of nature, an armored apocalypse that swept through the orc empires with impunity. Each victory was more glorious than the last. Each conquered world another jewel in the crown of their Gilded Quest. Within the halls of the Gloriana Invictus, victory feasts were held, the barons toasting their king and the wisdom of the Sacristans. Their faith in their holy purpose became absolute, their martial pride unassailable. They saw their effortless triumphs as proof of their righteousness, a sign that the Emperor himself guided their hands, but in their blindness they perceived only half the truth. They saw the Xenos die, but they did not feel the psychic resonance of the death. They did not sense the immense sector-spanning miasma of agony they were creating. Every orc that died screaming, every grot crushed under an iron heel, every life extinguished in terror and pain, contributed to a vast invisible reservoir of torment. The psychic death cry of Scraphold did not simply dissipate. It echoed in the warp, a pure note of suffering. The terror of Mecha Prime's fall settled over the system like a shroud. The Knights of House Hyperion were not merely killing orcs. They were tilling the fields of an entire sector with pain, cultivating a bumper crop of undiluted despair. And far away in the labyrinthine spires of Camorra, Archon Vresk Maladrak felt the first tremors of his grand harvest, and he smiled. The shepherds were performing their duties flawlessly. With the core orc empires of the Somnus Stars reduced to smoldering graveyards, the Gilded Quest did not pause for consolidation or reflection. There was no time, High Sacristan Kaelin's cogitators insisted, for such vanities. The pattern engines had detected new threats, fresh heresies festering in the shadows that the orc's brutal dominion had long suppressed. His pronouncements, delivered with the cold certainty of divine clockwork, painted a picture of a sector riddled with hidden cancers, each one demanding the immediate and uncompromising attention of House Hyperion's righteous blades. The knights, their spirits soaring on the wings of their unbroken string of victories, obeyed without question. They had become the hammer, and to them, every world was now a nail. The fleet's next target was the Vespedan Chain, a string of gas giants whose upper atmospheres were home to a reclusive and technologically advanced Xenos race. According to Kaelin's divinations, the Vespedan hegemony was secretly developing a weapon of stellar annihilation, a heresy of such magnitude that it could not be allowed to reach fruition. The evidence was irrefutable: complex energy signatures, cryptic intercepted transmissions, and augur ghosts of impossible gravitational fluctuations. It was, of course, a masterful fabrication, woven by the Archon's agents from stray cosmic phenomena and deliberate misinformation fed into the sector's few remaining deep space relays. The Vespid were a peaceful, scholarly race, their weapon a nascent attempt to create a stable, miniature star for energy production, a project of pure science, not malice. House Hyperion did not seek dialogue or confirmation. To them, the High Sacristan's word was truth. They descended upon the crystalline gas mining platforms and floating city-states of the Vespid like a plague of locusts. The war was brief, tragic, and utterly one-sided. The delicate Vespid, insectoid beings with bodies of fragile crystal, had no concept of total warfare. Their neutron blasters, while potent, were designed for mining and asteroid defense, not for punching through the ion shields and adamantium plate of a Knight Castellan. The Knights waded through their floating cities of spun crystal and solidified gases, their heavy weapons shattering irreplaceable works of art and millennia of accumulated knowledge with every volley. The Vespid fought to defend their homes with a desperate, flitting grace, but they were as moths against a furnace. Their cities fell from the skies in glittering showers of ruin, their people shattered into clouds of glittering dust. The psychic shriek of 1 billion sentient crystals being simultaneously pulverized was a unique and exquisite addition to the sector's growing symphony of pain. From the shattered Vespedan chain, the questing crusade plunged deeper into the Somnus Stars, following the trail of corrupted breadcrumbs laid out by the High Sacristan. Their next destination was the worlds of the Signian Compact, a human civilization that had been cut off from the Imperium since the Age of Strife. They had survived through grim determination, developing their own strange culture centered around ancestor worship and psychic augury. To the unyielding dogma of House Hyperion, they were not prodigal sons to be welcomed back into the fold, but dangerous heretics to be purged. Kaelin's data feeds conveniently highlighted their use of unsanctioned psychers and their divergent religious practices, painting them as a nascent chaos cult. The war against the Signians was a far more brutal affair. These were humans hardened by centuries of isolation and self-reliance. They possessed formidable armies and a fanatical will to defend their home systems, but they had never faced the sheer overwhelming power of a knightly house. The Knights of Hyperion made planetfall on Cygnus Prime, a world of tiered hive cities and Gothic fortresses, and began a systematic campaign of annihilation. They became figures from a terrifying mythology, steel giants striding through the ash and smoke, their weapons erasing armies, their very presence a refutation of the Cygnians' long-held independence. The Cygnians fought back with less cannons and basilisk batteries, their psychers weaving shields of Empyrean energy that flickered and died against the Knights' implacable advance. The Knights showed no mercy. They were the Emperor's wrath, and in their eyes, heresy could only be cleansed with fire. The screams of the burning psychers and the despair of a civilization watching its history being erased, chapter by bloody chapter, fed the growing reservoir of torment that now saturated the very fabric of the sector. After Cygnus came the silent, dead worlds of the Ortgeist, a minor Necron dynasty that had only just begun to stir from its eons-long slumber. Kaelin's augurs presented them as an imminent, overwhelming threat. In truth, they were barely active, a tomb world with only a few thousand functional warriors and a dormant overlord. The Knights fell upon them with the full force of their crusade. The ensuing battle was a strange, silent spectacle. Gauss flares stripped atom-thick layers from knightly armor, while thermal cannons and battle cannons blasted Necron warriors into their constituent parts, only for them to phase back into reality moments later. It was a war of attrition that House Hyperion, with its sheer firepower and numbers, was destined to win. They pushed into the heart of the primary tomb complex, shattering canoptech constructs and immortals with equal prejudice, their heavy stomps echoing in the silent Cyclopean halls. They reached the central sarcophagus chamber and, believing they were destroying the dynasty's command nexus, they obliterated the dormant overlord with a concentrated barrage, ensuring the dynasty would never properly awaken. The cold, sterile, and emotionless defeat of the Necrons added a final, chilling undertone to the sector's psychic cacophony, the utter despair of a reawakening mind snuffed out before it could even achieve consciousness. Their path was a scar of devastation carved across an entire sector. They left behind a trail of tears, a corridor of broken worlds and traumatized systems. They moved with the speed and purpose of a divine wind, never lingering to witness the true consequences of their actions. They did not see the Vespidin chain, once a wonder of the void, now a debris field of silent, glittering shards. They did not see the fires on Cygnus Prime burn for years, consuming the last vestiges of a unique human culture. They did not feel the profound silence settle over the Ortgeist as its last chance at a future was extinguished. The nobles of House Hyperion saw only the glory of their Gilded Quest, the endless procession of victories affirming their divine mandate. Their honor was polished to a brilliant sheen with the blood of millions, their righteousness built upon a foundation of expertly crafted lies. Each system they pacified was a world bled dry of hope and resistance, its people left broken, its defenses shattered, its spirit crushed. They were a calamity, a natural disaster in the form of a knightly house, perfectly preparing the ground, harrowing the fields of sorrow, and making them ready for the true reapers who waited patiently in the wings. The Gilded Quest, now a maelstrom of conquest that had raged for decades across the Somnus stars, was directed by the High Sacristan to its ultimate, glorious purpose. The final thread in Archon Maladrak's grand tapestry of deception was a world designated Viridia Prime. Kaelin's divinations, now delivered with a tone of almost messianic fervor, painted Viridia as the nexus of all the sector's evils, the heart of a vast multi-species confederacy of rebellion and heresy, aimed squarely at the heart of the Imperium. It was described as a fortress world of unimaginable strength, the command center from which the Orc empires, the Vespidin hegemony, and the Cygnian Compact had all been secretly manipulated. It was the lair of the beast, the black heart of the sector's defiance, and its destruction was presented as the climactic, defining act of their holy crusade. The truth was, as always, more pathetic and far more tragic. Viridia Prime was the most populous and developed human world in the Somnus stars, a former imperial holding that had, like Cygnus, been cut off for centuries. Unlike the isolationist Cygnians, the Viridians had thrived through trade and reluctant diplomacy, forging a small, independent federation of nearby systems for mutual protection. They were pragmatic, resilient, and staunchly independent, having survived by their own strength for so long that the idea of bowing to a distant, half-forgotten Terra was anathema to them. Their confederacy of rebellion was a simple defensive pact, and their unimaginable strength was the result of a culture that had learned the hard way that the galaxy was a hostile and unforgiving place. They were not heretics, they were survivors. When the fleet of House Hyperion translated into their system, a titanic armada of Gothic warships blotting out the stars, the Viridians did not cower. They had seen the Crusade's bloody swath cut through the sector. They had received fragmented, terrified reports from fleeing survivors. They knew what was coming. They knew there would be no negotiation, no quarter, so they prepared for war. Their orbital stations, bristling with macro cannons and lance batteries, powered their void shields. Their system defense fleet, a mix of ancient Imperial designs and locally produced warships, formed a defiant line. On the planet below, the Viridian Guard, a professional and well-equipped army numbering in the billions, manned the trench lines and fortress cities that girdled the planet's primary continent. The battle for Viridia Prime began in the Void, and it was the first real challenge House Hyperion had faced. The Viridian fleet, though smaller, was commanded by admirals who knew their home system intimately. They used the gravitic currents of their gas giants in the cover of dense asteroid fields to execute daring hit-and-run attacks, inflicting actual casualties on the Crusade's screening vessels. But the sheer, overwhelming mass of the Hyperion fleet was an undeniable force. The Gloriana Invictus was a weapon against which the Viridians had no answer. Its ancient, unknowable power tore the heart out of their naval formations. After 3 weeks of brutal attritional warfare in the cold dark, the Viridian fleet was broken, its last ships fighting to the last man to buy the planet below, just a few more hours to prepare. Then came the planetary assault. This was no swift cleansing like on Scraphold. This was a grinding, world-spanning war of extermination. The nights descended into a storm of flak and laser fire that turned the skies into a flickering tapestry of death. Entire lances of armigers were swatted from the air, exploding in mid-air fireballs. Even the ion shields of the Questores-class knights were tested, flickering and failing under the sheer volume of coordinated fire from planetary defense lasers. When they finally touched down, they found themselves in a hellish landscape of fortified trenches, tank traps the size of hab blocks, and artillery emplacements dug deep into the mountainsides. The war for Viridia Prime became the crucible of House Hyperion's crusade. Every meter of ground was paid for in blood and spent shells. The Viridian Guard fought with the ferocity of cornered wolves, using their knowledge of the terrain to set ambushes, their Shadow-Zord super-heavy tanks dueling with knights in the tight confines of blasted cities. For the first time, the nobles of House Hyperion felt the cold touch of fear. They saw their comrades fall, their magnificent steeds brought crashing down by concentrated fire from Baneblade cannons, or overwhelmed by waves of suicidal infantry armed with melta charges. The glory of the quest was burned away in the fires of this apocalyptic conflict, replaced by a grim, hate-fueled determination to simply prevail. The fighting was most brutal in the capital city of Acropolis Majoris, a hive sprawl of adamantium and rockcrete that stretched for 1,000 kilometers. Here, the war devolved into a brutal, street-by-street slog. Knights, too large for many of the thoroughfares, used their chainswords and thermal cannons to carve new paths through the urban landscape, toppling hab spires and shattering manufactorums. The Viridian Guard fought for every hab block, every intersection, their infantry swarming the legs of the knights, while Lehman Russ battle tanks laid down covering fire from fortified positions. The suffering on Viridia Prime reached a scale that dwarfed everything that had come before. The civilian population was caught in the crossfire of a war between giants. Cities were leveled, continents set ablaze. The psychic scream of the dying was no longer a collection of sharp notes, but a constant, grinding roar of pure, undiluted agony that permeated the very soil and air of the planet. This was the crescendo Archon Maladrak had been waiting for. The sheer, concentrated misery of this single world was worth more to his harvest than all the others combined. He had engineered a perfect storm of suffering. The unyielding, fanatical might of House Hyperion pitched against the unbreakable, desperate defiance of the Viridian people. It was a symphony of terror, a masterpiece of orchestrated pain, High King Arator, his own knight Oathkeeper scarred and battered, its heraldry blackened by fire and ordnance, fought at the forefront of the bloodiest engagements. He saw the cost of this war, the pyres of his own fallen knights and the mountains of Viridian dead, and felt not doubt, but a hardening of his resolve. To him, the ferocity of their resistance was the ultimate proof of their guilt. Only a people utterly steeped in heresy and rebellion could fight with such malice. He pushed his house harder, demanding ever greater sacrifices, his belief in the righteousness of his cause calcified by the very horror he was inflicting. The crucible of Viridia was forging him, and all of House Hyperion, into perfect unwitting instruments of damnation, their honor being scoured away with every life they took, their souls being irrevocably stained by a war whose true purpose they could not begin to comprehend. The war for Viridia Prime had raged for 3 grueling years. The planet was a ruin, its biosphere collapsing under the weight of ceaseless, globe-spanning conflict. Acropolis Majoris, once a testament to human resilience, was now a jagged, skeletal forest of shattered spires shrouded in a perpetual twilight of smoke and ash. Yet the Viridians refused to break. Deep within the ruins of the Magna Palladium, the planet's central administrative and military command complex, Lord General Castor Evandris, the supreme commander of the Viridian Guard, orchestrated a masterful and bloody defense. He was a brilliant, iron-willed strategist who had spent his entire life studying the art of war, and he used every resource, every trick, every ounce of his people's fanaticism to make House Hyperion pay for every inch of ground and blood. Under his command, the Viridian Guard had become masters of asymmetric warfare against the knights. They had learned to channel their attacks, to focus the firepower of entire regiments onto a single knight, overwhelming its ion shield and blasting it apart with 1,000 simultaneous impacts. They collapsed entire city sectors into rubble-choked canyons, creating kill zones where super-heavy tanks could ambush the towering war engines at point-blank range. Their stubborn, intelligent resistance had bled House Hyperion white. Nearly a third of the knights who had made planetfall were now silent, rusting hulks littering the blasted landscape, their pilots' names added to the ever-growing roll of honor aboard the Gloriana Invictus. Morale, once unshakable, was beginning to fray. The glorious quest had devolved into a meat grinder, and the whispers of doubt, though unspoken, could be felt in the strained silence of the command decks. High King Arator the Valiant saw the wavering in his household. He saw the fatigue in the eyes of his barons, and the grim set of his princeps' jaws. He knew that a decisive legendary act was needed to shatter the Viridian will to fight and reinvigorate the spirit of his own warriors. He would not allow their holy crusade to stall and die in this urban quagmire. The target was identified, Lord General Evandris himself. Intelligence gleaned from the brutal interrogation of captured officers pinpointed his command bunker deep beneath the ruins of the Magna Palladium. A conventional assault would cost them dozens more nights and months of fighting. Arator decided on a different path. He would be the tip of the spear, the personal embodiment of the house's fury. He chose 5 of his most loyal and skilled princeps to accompany him, his own royal lance. They would pilot their knights through the most heavily defended sector of the city, a direct, suicidal charge aimed at the heart of the Viridian command structure. Arator himself would not pilot the Oathkeeper. For this charge, he chose a heavier, more formidable steed, the Knight Castellan known as the Fist of Retribution. It was a walking fortress, its twin plasma cores glowing with barely contained stellar energies, its shoulders mounting a volcano cannon and a plasma decimator, weapons capable of leveling city blocks. The charge of the Royal Lance was an act of pure distilled violence. They advanced under the cover of a rolling artillery barrage from the Crusade fleet in orbit, orbital strikes that turned the landscape ahead of them into a shifting sea of fire and earth. Still, the Viridian response was ferocious. A wall of laser and shellfire erupted from hidden bunkers and fortified ruins. Arator's companions began to fall. The first Sir Kalen and his Knight Crusader was brought down when a shadow sword appearing from a camouflaged dugout put a volcano cannon shell directly into its cockpit. The second, Lady Jorek and her gallant, was swarmed by hundreds of Viridian guardsmen who used grappling hooks to scale her machine, planting meltabombs that cooked her alive inside her own cockpit. Arator did not falter. He was a storm of righteous hatred. the fist of retribution, a force of nature. His shield breaker missiles obliterated bunkers from a mile away. His plasma decimator fired in great pulsing blasts of blue-white energy, vaporized squadrons of Lehman Russ tanks. He pushed ever onward, ignoring the damage reports screaming from his console, shrugging off hits that would have crippled a lesser machine. He alone breached the final perimeter of the Magna Palatium, smashing through the ferrocrete walls and striding into the cavernous vaulted space of the central command chamber. There, waiting for him, was not some cowering commander in a bunker, but Lord General Evandris, strapped into the command throne of his own personal war machine. A Stormblade super heavy tank, its massive plasma blast gun humming with a deadly charge. The chamber was a maelstrom of activity, with hundreds of guardsmen taking up firing positions on gantries and behind barricades. So the tyrant comes himself. Evandris's voice boomed over the chamber's voxcasters, filled with cold, weary defiance. You have murdered my world, monster, but you will not have my people's spirit. The duel that followed was a legend forged in fire and hate. The Stormblade's blast gun fired, a searing wave of energy that slammed into the Knight Castellan, causing its iron shield to collapse and its adamantium armor to glow cherry red. A raider staggered but returned fire with his own plasma decimator, a direct hit that blew one of the Stormblade's sponsons clean off. The guardsmen opened up with everything they had, a storm of lass fire and heavy bolter rounds that ricocheted harmlessly from Eritor's thick plating. Eritor ignored the infantry. His focus was entirely on the enemy commander. He charged, his immense weight shaking the very foundations of the Palladium. He brought the fist of retribution's titanic feet down, one after the other, crushing lesser tanks and artillery pieces that stood in his path. The Stormblade maneuvered, its tracks churning up the tiled floor, firing again and again. Eritor's machine was failing, alarms blaring a symphony of its impending demise, but he had one last weapon. He leveled the volcano cannon, its barrel glowing with an impossible heat. He fired at point-blank range. The beam of coherent thermal energy, hotter than a star's core, struck the Stormblade's turret. The super-heavy tank's armor offered no resistance. It was not penetrated. It was instantly sublimated. The beam went straight through the turret, through Lord General Evandris, and out the other side, flash vaporizing him and his command crew. The Stormblade's ammunition and power core detonated a second later in a massive rolling explosion that tore the roof from the command chamber and immolated every remaining Viridian soldier. High King Eritor stood victorious in his heavily damaged knight, the fires of his foe's demise reflecting in its optical lenses. The duel was over. He had personally slain the enemy warlord. The news, broadcast across all channels, was the blow that finally shattered the Viridian Guard's will to fight. Their command structure was decapitated, their leader a martyr. Organized resistance collapsed within days, replaced by pockets of hopeless defiance that were quickly and brutally crushed. Aboard the fleet, the victory was celebrated with a fervor born of relief and renewed faith. High King Eritor was no longer just their king. He was Eritor the Valiant, the hero of Viridia, the man who had personally broken the back of the greatest threat their crusade had ever faced. His legend was forged, his name etched into the annals of the house's history forever. Their unshakable faith in the Gilded Quest was restored, their sacrifices justified, their blindness to the true nature of their war now absolute and complete. They had won. They had finally cleansed the Somnus stars of its great evil, unaware that the true evil was just beginning to stir, its hunger whetted by the grand feast they had so painstakingly prepared. The celebrations of victory were a grand and solemn affair. Aboard the Gloriana Invictus, the names of the fallen at Viridia were carved into the great basalt monolith in the Hall of Heroes, their sacrifice given meaning by the total and crushing defeat of their enemies. High King Eritor the Valiant, his legend now cemented, presided over the rites, his voice echoing with the certainty of a man who believes he has perfectly executed the will of his god. The Crusade fleet, battered but triumphant, spent months in the Viridia system, repairing their warships, rearming their knights, and carrying out the final purges on the ruined planet below. The mood was one of grim satisfaction, the quiet pride of a difficult and costly duty fulfilled. They had scoured the Somnus stars, they believed, and brought the Emperor's light to its darkest corner. Their Gilded Quest was complete. It was during this period of consolidation that the first subtle signs of a deeper wrongness began to manifest. Long-range auger arrays sweeping the now quiet sector began to return sensor ghosts that defied explanation, fleeting knife-thin energy signatures that vanished before they could be properly scanned, gravitational anomalies that bloomed and faded in the blink of an eye. The Sacristans, led by Kalen, dismissed them as residual warp echoes from the decades of intense warfare, the death screams of so many billions of souls causing turbulence in the Hyperion. It was a logical, reassuring explanation, and the knights, eager to believe their work was done, accepted it without question. Their departure from the Viridia system was a stately, triumphant procession, the entire fleet gleaming with fresh repairs and repainted heraldry, powered up its plasma drives and prepared for a long, glorious voyage home to Hyperia. As the last of their escort cruisers prepared to translate into the warp, the Viridian sun was eclipsed, not by a moon or some natural stellar phenomenon, but by a tide of impossible blackness that poured into reality from nowhere. Across the sector, in the void between the worlds they had so brutally pacified, reality itself began to bleed. The fabric of space, stretched thin and raw by the psychic resonance of unimaginable suffering, tore open. From these shimmering, non-Euclidean rents emerged the fleets of the Drukhari. They did not arrive with the thunder and fury of an imperial armada. They simply appeared, silent and predatory, their ships shaped like razors and hooks, their hulls wrought from psychically resonant bone and pulsating organic membranes. They were a fleet of nightmares given form, moving with the unnatural swiftness of sharks scenting blood in the water. This was the fleet of the Cabal of the Flayed Iris, and it was a sight of terrible majesty. At its head was the pallid throne, Archon Vrask Maladrak's personal flagship, a vessel so vast it was closer to a mobile fortress spire than a starship, its surface crawling with tortured souls bound into its very structure, their silent screams providing a fraction of its motive power. Behind it came flotillas of sleek torture-class cruisers and squadrons of venom-class destroyers, their prows adorned with living captives and flayed banners that writhed in the solar winds. From their cavernous launch bays vomited clouds of needle fighter interceptors and slave ships designed not for combat, but for the swift and brutal harvesting of sentient life. They did not engage the departing Hyperion fleet. That was not their purpose. The knights were the plow, and their work was now done. The Drukhari were the reapers, and the harvest was about to begin. They descended upon the broken, leaderless worlds left in the Crusade's wake with a speed and coordinated cruelty that was breathtaking in its efficiency. On Viridia Prime, the shell-shocked survivors, just beginning to crawl from their bunkers into the ruins of their world, looked up to see a new and more terrible darkness fall. Slaver ships descended on gossamer wings of gravitic energy, their hulls opening to disgorge legions of Kabbalite warriors and lithe acrobatic waches. The Viridians, their armies shattered, their spirits broken, could offer no meaningful resistance. They were herded like cattle, rounded up by the thousands with nets of electrified wire and agony-inducing splinter fire. The Drukhari were not there to conquer. They were there to claim their property. Every shriek of terror, every cry of despair from a mother seeing her child dragged away, was a delicious psychic morsel, a prelude to the main course that awaited in the dark city. The same scene was repeated across the Somnus stars, a synchronized, sector-wide operation of mass abduction. On the crystalline shards of the Vespidan chain, specialized Drukhari constructs gathered the glittering dust of the shattered Xenos, their arcane technology capable of reanimating the crystalline consciousnesses for an eternity of torment. On Cygnus Prime, the surviving humans who had hidden from the knights were hunted through the ruins of their hives by shrieking hellions and hulking grotesques. Even on the dead orc worlds, scavenger covens descended, their homunculi masters eager to collect fresh subjects for their flesh-sculpting experiments, finding a perverse joy in reanimating the brutish Xenos into twisted parodies of life. The entire Somnus stars became the personal larder of Archon Vrask Maladrak. The corridor of suffering carved by House Hyperion was now a perfect, unimpeded highway for his soul-harvesting fleets. Each world had been tenderized, its defenses shattered, its populace psychologically broken and primed for the exquisite despair the Drukhari so craved. The Knights' Holy War had been nothing more than the first stage of a Camorrite industrial process. The sheer scale of the operation was unprecedented, the largest coordinated soul theft in the history of the Dark City. Trillions of souls, each screaming with a unique flavor of agony, were funneled through temporary webway portals that now gaped open in the void of every system. They were a torrent of stolen life force, a river of pain flowing directly into the waiting reservoirs of Camorra, enough to power the city for millennia, enough to elevate Vrask Maladrak to a position of power undreamt of even by his rivals. As the Hyperion fleet, ignorant and proud, finally entered the warp, the last of their sensor readings from the Viridia system was of a sudden sector-wide energy bloom. The High King and his advisors saw it as the final, explosive death throes of a rebellious star system. They did not see the shadow of the flayed iris fall, and they did not hear the silent collective scream of a trillion souls being dragged into a hell from which there was no escape. Lady Elysia of House Hyperion was not like the other nobles, where they saw glory in the clash of arms and honor in the execution of duty. She saw patterns in the chaos and sought logic in the divine. She was a princeps of a knight-errant, the stellar courser, and her skill in the throne mechanicum was unquestioned, but her true passion lay in the cold, hard certainty of stellar cartography and gravitational mathematics. During the long decades of the Gilded Quest, while others practiced their dueling forms or recounted tales of valor, she spent her time in the observatorium domes of the Gloriana Invictus, watching the silent dance of distant stars. It was this obsession with celestial mechanics that first sowed the seeds of a terrible, world-shattering doubt in her mind. Her disquiet began during the final stages of the Viridia campaign. While plotting the fleet's final departure, she noted a series of minute but persistent gravitational anomalies. They were like ripples in the fabric of space-time, too organized for natural phenomena and too fleeting to be the signature of any conventional starship drive. When she cross-referenced them with the augur ghosts that the fleet's sensors had been detecting, a disturbing pattern emerged. These anomalies were not random. They were predictive. They appeared in empty space hours or even days before the Crusade fleet would arrive at a new, supposedly uncharted target system, as if something was preceding them, subtly altering the gravitational tides to ensure a smooth and untroubled passage for their real space transit. It was almost as if the path of their holy quest was being cleared for them by an unseen hand. When she presented these initial findings to her peers, she was met with condescending dismissal. They called it battle fatigue, the overactive imagination of a scholar trying to find reason in a galaxy of chaos. High Sacristan Kalen, when she dared to question him, was even more severe. His synthesized voice dripped with mechanical scorn as he explained that these were simply manifestations of the Omnissiah's divine will, the machine god smoothing the path for his chosen warriors. To question them was to question the very faith that underpinned their crusade. Chastised but not convinced, Elysia retreated to her studies, her suspicions now a burning coal of certainty in her gut. Her investigation became a covert and dangerous obsession. She knew she could not trust the official data streams from the sanctum of celestial cartomancy. If her suspicions were correct, the corruption lay at the very source. She began a painstaking process of manually reviewing archival data from the Crusade's inception, comparing the sanctum's divinely inspired course corrections with the raw, uninterpreted stellar data collected by the Invictus's most ancient and disconnected deep space auspex arrays. It was a Herculean task akin to finding a single misaligned cog in a machine the size of a continent. For months, she found nothing but perfect correlation. The Sacristans' prophecies, no matter how outlandish, were always borne out by the fleet's findings. The Orc empires, the Vespidan threat, the Signian heresy, all were exactly where Kalen had said they would be. It was a perfection that was, in itself, suspicious. The galaxy was not this neat, this predictable. Then she found it, a single anomalous data point from the very beginning of their journey into the Somnus stars. A deep space probe had registered a burst of high-frequency transmission, impossibly faint and complex, originating from the Gloriana Invictus itself, and aimed at a ghost vessel that had shadowed their fleet for less than a second before vanishing. The transmission's energy signature did not match any known Imperial or Xenos technology. It was tight-beamed, encrypted, and gone in an instant. Crucially, the Sanctum's official logs had no record of this transmission. It had been scrubbed, erased so completely that only the raw, isolated data from a single, forgotten probe still held its ghost. This was the proof she needed. Something aboard their flagship was communicating with an unknown party, and the Sacristans were covering it up. Her focus shifted from the stars to the heart of the ship, to the sanctum itself. Gaining access was impossible. It was a holy place, sealed to all but Kalen and his tech adepts. Using her authority as a noble princeps, she requisitioned servitors and scoured the ship's ancient schematics, searching for a forgotten conduit, a service crawl space, anything that might lead her to the sanctum's outer shell. She found one, a disused plasma conduit, sealed for centuries, that ran adjacent to the cogitator core chamber. Donning the rugged gear of a voidsman, she descended into the ship's mechanical guts. The journey took days, crawling through suffocatingly tight, dust-choked tunnels, the groaning of the ship's ancient structure her only companion. She finally reached the conduit running alongside the sanctum. The wall of the holy chamber pulsed with a low, thrumming energy, and the air was cold enough to frost her rebreather. Using a high-powered auspex she had brought with her, she began scanning the chamber through the thick adamantium wall. What she found made her blood run cold. Beneath the layers of sacred shielding and holy wards, beneath the thrumming power of the great cogitator, was another energy signature. It was biological, parasitic, and utterly alien. It was a living thing, a grotesque fusion of technology and warped flesh, grafted directly onto the core processing unit of the sanctum's main cogitator. It was a hideous, pulsating node of bone-white tissue and shimmering crystalline filaments, subtly, almost imperceptibly, altering the flow of data, twisting every calculation, poisoning every prophecy at its source. It was a Drukhari device, a masterpiece of homunculi bioengineering, designed not to destroy the cogitator, but to subvert it, to make it lie with the perfect, unimpeachable authority of a god. Suddenly, it all made sense. The convenient discovery of enemy after enemy, the unnaturally perfect intelligence, the smoothed path through the sector's gravitational tides, the Gilded Quest, their centuries-long holy war, their every victory, their every sacrifice, had been a lie. They were not crusaders. They were puppets, their strings pulled by a malevolent, unseen intelligence, their glorious war nothing but a preparatory slaughter for a purpose so vile she could barely comprehend it. The full weight of their unwitting complicity crashed down upon her. Every orc they had killed, every vespid they had shattered, every viridian they had burned, it had all been a service rendered to some monstrous hidden master. Their honor, the very bedrock of their existence, was not just stained, it was a fraud, a hollow mockery that had cost trillions of lives. In the cold, dark silence of the service conduit, Lady Elysia began to weep, not for the future, but for the damnation they had already so eagerly embraced. Lady Elysia emerged from the bowels of the Gloriana Invictus, a changed woman. The youthful curiosity in her eyes had been replaced by the haunted, ancient gaze of someone who had stared into the deepest abyss and seen her own reflection. For days she remained secluded in her quarters, the horrifying truth of physical weight that threatened to crush her. She replayed every battle, every victory toast, every name carved into the Hall of Heroes, and saw them now through a lens of profound sickness. Their entire history for the last 3 centuries was a monument to a lie, built on a foundation of orchestrated genocide. The weight of trillions of souls, murdered not in the name of the Emperor, but for the pleasure of some unspeakable Xenos, rested squarely on the shoulders of her house. She knew she could not bear this burden alone. To reveal the truth would be to detonate a bomb in the very soul of House Hyperion. It would shatter their faith, invalidate their sacrifices, and perhaps tear the entire household apart in a civil war of recrimination and despair. But to remain silent was unthinkable. It would be the ultimate act of cowardice, allowing the true enemy to savor their victory, while House Hyperion sailed away in blissful, blood-soaked ignorance. Her duty, she realized with grim finality, was no longer to her house's glory, but to its soul, however blackened and corrupted it had become. She requested an immediate audience with the High King. Her summons, coming from a princeps known for her reclusive scholarship, was unusual enough to be granted instantly. She was brought before the throne of the High King, not in the Grand Nave, but in Erator's private strategy chamber. The room was stark and martial, its walls covered with holographic displays showing the victorious march of their crusade. Erator the Valiant sat at a massive oak table, studying a chart of their proposed route back to the Segmentum Solar, a faint, proud smile on his face. With him were the highest-ranking barons of the household, the grizzled veterans who formed his inner circle. Lady Elysia, Arator greeted, his voice warm and paternal. "It is good to see you. Join us. We are charting the final leg of our glorious journey. Your expertise in stellar navigation will be most welcome." Elysia did not return the smile. She walked to the center of the room, her face a pale, taut mask of anguish. She carried a single data slate. "High King," she began, her voice trembling, but clear. "I have not come to discuss our route home. I have come to tell you that our journey has been a lie. Our crusade, our Gilded Quest, has been an act of damnation." A stunned silence fell over the room. The barons stared at her, their expressions shifting from confusion to anger. One of them, the hot-tempered Baron Volkov, slammed his fist on the table. "What madness is this? Have you lost your senses, woman? Watch your tongue before you speak treason." "It is not treason, my lord, but, truth more terrible than any heresy," Elysia replied, her gaze fixed on the High King. She placed the data slate on the table. "Everything we have done in the Somnus stars, every world we have cleansed, every enemy we have slain, we have done so at the behest of another. We have been manipulated. We have been the unwitting agents of the Drukhari." She laid out her findings with cold, methodical precision. She presented the navigational anomalies, the impossible perfection of their intelligence, the ghost transmission from the flagship. Then, with a voice cracking with emotion, she described what she had found grafted to the core of the Sanctum's cogitator, the parasitic bioengineered device that had been whispering poison prophecies into the ears of their high sacristan for centuries. She explained how it had twisted their holy quest, turning their righteous fury into a tool, guiding them to slaughter and weaken world after world, not for the glory of the Imperium, but to prepare them for a harvest. The agony of revelation descended upon the chamber like a physical shroud. The barons, men who had faced down orc titans and stood firm on battlements crumbling under orbital fire, looked utterly broken. Their faces, hardened by centuries of war, crumpled in expressions of dawning horror. The glory of their victories curdled into the shame of their complicity. The names of their fallen, once martyrs to a holy cause, were now victims of a grotesque deception. Their honor, the currency of their entire existence, was revealed to be counterfeit, leaving them spiritually bankrupt. High King Arator said nothing. He stared at the data slate, his face ashen, the proud light in his eyes extinguished and replaced by a hollow, bottomless despair. He was Arator the Valiant, the hero of Viridia, the slayer of the Lord General, a legend forged in the crucible of that war. And now he knew that his greatest triumph was his deepest shame. The duel in the Magna Palladium was not a heroic act to break a rebellion, but the final, brutal flourish of a farmer slaughtering the prize bull before the rest of the herd was carted away. Every cheer for his victory had been an accolade for his servitude. He was not a king, a crusader, a hero. He was the chief butcher in an abattoir designed by monsters. He slowly rose from his chair, his movements stiff and ancient. He walked to the great armored window that looked out upon the star-dusted void. For a long time he was silent, his back to the room. The only sound was the quiet, ragged breathing of old men whose worlds had just ended. When he finally spoke, his voice was not the booming command of a king, but the dry, rasping whisper of a damned soul. "Get me the High Sacristan," he said, his words devoid of any emotion. "Bring Kalen to me, now." The order was not a request. It was a death sentence. The illusion that had sustained House Hyperion for 300 years was shattered. All that was left was the horrifying, unbearable truth and the agonizing question of what came next. The confrontation took place in the nave of the Gloriana Invictus. The great hall, once the stage for their triumphant celebrations, was now a silent, funereal chamber. The knightly barons and princeps were assembled not in their finery, but in their stark, black under-carapaces, their faces grim and haunted. The stained glass windows depicting their past glories seemed a cruel mockery, scenes from a life that belonged to another, more naive house. High King Arator stood before his throne, not upon it, his posture radiating a cold, coiled fury that was more terrifying than any battle rage. High Sacristan Kalen was brought into the hall, flanked by two hulking night wardens, his usual procession of tech adepts and servitors conspicuously absent. The machine man seemed oblivious to the funereal atmosphere, his optical sensors whirring placidly as he surveyed the assembled nobles. The parasitic device nested in his core programming did not allow for the comprehension of concepts like shame or dishonor. It only understood the cold logic of its Archon's grand design. High King Arator, Kalen's synthesized voices chorused, the sound unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. You have summoned me. Does the Omnissiah offer new guidance for our glorious return? Have the pattern engines discerned a fresh... Silence. Arator's voice was a low growl that cut through the mechanical cadence like a razor. He took a single step forward, his eyes, burning with a self-loathing fire, fixed on the sacristan's brass faceplate. For 3 centuries, this house has followed your guidance. We have trusted your divinations as the word of the machine. God himself, we have bled for your prophecies. We have died for them. He gestured to Lady Elysia, who stood beside him, her face pale but resolute. Lady Elysia has shown us the truth. She has shown us the corruption at your heart, a Xenos parasite, Kalen, a Drukhari cancer fused to the very soul of the sanctum, to your soul. For the first time, Kalen's whirring mechadendrites stilled. The parasitic node, sensing an existential threat, overrode his primary functions. A subtle, oily quality, a hint of sibilant cruelty that was utterly alien, bled into his synthesized voice. The path you walked was one of glory, uninterrupted victory. Is that not the only truth that matters? The weak were purged, the strong prevailed. Such is the logic of the galaxy. That admission, so callous and devoid of remorse, was the spark that ignited the pyre. A wave of pure, unrestrained fury washed through the assembled nobles. This was the voice of their puppet master, speaking through the mouth of the man they had revered as a prophet. The logic of the galaxy, Arator whispered, his voice dangerously soft. He began to walk slowly towards Kalen, his every step echoing like a hammer blow. Tell me of logic, machine. Was there logic in the screams of the Vespid as their crystal cities rained from the sky? Was there logic in the eyes of the Signian children as we burned their homes? Was there logic in the defiance of the Viridians who died defending their world from monsters who believed themselves to be saints? Arator was now standing directly before Kalen, his towering human frame face to face with the Sacristan's mechanical monstrosity. You did not give us glory. You gave us damnation. You turned our honor into a weapon to be used against us. You made us the architects of a hell for others, and in doing so you have built a deeper hell for ourselves. He reached out and with a snarl of disgust, ripped the Sacristan's primary optical sensor from its socket. Kalen jerked back, emitting a burst of static, but the knights at his side held him firm. Arator turned to face his household, his face a mask of terrible righteous rage. We have been defiled, our history, our victories, our very name has been poisoned beyond redemption. We cannot sail for Hyperia, we cannot return to the Imperium as heroes, for we are the unwitting janissaries of the arch-enemy, our hands stained with the blood of the innocent, our souls forfeit. His voice rose to a deafening roar that shook the very rafters of the nave. But we are not yet dead. We are knights of the Imperium, and if our honor cannot be restored, then it shall be avenged. The Gilded Quest is over. It was a lie from its very inception. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger back the way their fleet had come, back towards the haunted, silent void of the Somnus stars. A new crusade begins today, a crusade of vengeance, a crusade of penance. We will not seek glory, for we are no longer worthy of it. We will not seek victory, for there can be no true victory against this shame. We seek only to find the puppet masters who pulled our strings. We will find the shadow that has darkened our house, and we will drag it, kicking and screaming, into the fires of our hatred. He paused, his chest heaving, his eyes sweeping across the faces of his warriors. He saw their despair, their shame, and their fury reflected back at him 1,000-fold. They were a house united not by pride, but by a collective, burning self-hatred. We turn the fleet around. We will retrace our steps through the graveyard we created. We will follow the trail of our own sin back to its source. This is my vow as your king. We will find the authors of our damnation, and we will repay them in blood and ruin. This is our penitent turn. This is our only path to absolution." A single unified roar of assent answered him. It was not a cheer of glory, but a howl of pure, nihilistic rage. It was the cry of a fallen house, damned and aware of it, choosing to embrace their fall and ride it down into a final, apocalyptic confrontation. The order was given. The vast, majestic fleet of House Hyperion, a force that had cut a swath of destruction across an entire sector, began the slow, ponderous process of turning around. It was no longer a crusade of conquest. It was a funeral procession hunting for its own murderers. The journey back through the somnus stars was a pilgrimage through a gallery of their own atrocities. The knights of House Hyperion, now stripped of their gilded delusions, saw the worlds they had pacified with new, horrified eyes. They passed the silent debris fields of the Vespiden chain, the glittering dust of a murdered culture catching the light of a distant star like a billion frozen tears. They saw the pyres still burning on Cygnus Prime, the smoke a permanent funeral shroud over a world of ghosts. They saw the dead stillness of the orc systems, the silence where there should have been the cacophony of life, however brutish. Each system was a verse in an epic poem of their damnation, a testament to their unwitting crime. The sector was not empty. The knights' augurs, now meticulously scrubbed of the Sacristans' influence and guided by Lady Elysia's cold logic, began to detect the lingering traces of the true enemy. They found the psychic residue of unimaginable terror, the faint energy signatures of fleeting webway portals, and the debris of sleek, razor-proud vessels that bore no resemblance to any ship in the Imperial Registry. Most chillingly, they found the worlds they had left behind to be not just dead, but hollowed out, picked clean of life. The Viridian system, when they re-entered it, was a tomb. The planet was a silent rock, its remaining ruins showing signs of a swift, brutally efficient occupation and abduction. There were no bodies, there were no survivors. There was only an oppressive, soul-crushing silence. Using the captive and partially dissected High Sacristan Kalen as a grotesque compass, Lady Elysia's technicians were able to trace the lingering command signals that had guided their crusade. The Drukhari parasite, now fighting for its survival, inadvertently led them to its master. The trail converged on a single impossible point in the void, a region of space that appeared empty to all conventional sensors, but radiated a psychic miasma of pure, concentrated agony that made the astropaths aboard the fleet scream until their throats were raw. As they drew closer, it resolved into view. It was not a planet or a starbase, but a construct of pure horror, a real space anchor for the Dark City's ravenous appetite. The Drukhari called it the Agony Spire. It was a colossal edifice of polished bone, flayed skin, stretched taut over a framework of writhing metal, and pulsating veins of an unknown glowing substance. It rose for hundreds of kilometers from a swirling vortex of emerald energy, a raw, bleeding wound into the webway. Captured asteroids and the husks of butchered starships orbited it like vultures, converted into processing plants and slave pens. A vast fleet of Kabalite warships patrolled the perimeter, their forms like slivers of obsidian against the sickening light of the portal. This was the nexus of the soul harvest, the abattoir's central processing floor, where the trillions of lives stolen from the somnus stars were being tallied, tortured for maximum psychic yield, and funneled into the insatiable gullet of Camorra. There was no debate, there was no grand strategy session. High King Erator, his face a permanent mask of grim resolve, looked upon the obscene structure and gave the only order that mattered. "All ships," he broadcast across the fleet's command channel, his voice flat and devoid of hope. "Full assault. Leave nothing of that obscenity standing. No prisoners, no mercy. We have come here not for victory, but for annihilation, ours and theirs." The penitent crusade of House Hyperion threw itself at the Agony Spire with the fury of a dying star. It was not a tactical engagement, it was a suicidal charge on a fleet-wide scale. The Gloriana Invictus led the way, its ancient and mighty prow aimed like a dagger at the heart of the Drukhari formation. Its Nova cannon fired not at a single ship, but into the thickest concentration of the enemy fleet, the resulting stellar detonation vaporizing a dozen Kabalite cruisers in a silent, blossoming flower of death. The Drukhari, caught by surprise by the sheer nihilistic ferocity of the attack, responded with their typical cruel precision. Their ships were faster, more maneuverable, dancing through the lumbering Imperial formations like predatory fish. Dark light lances, beams of pure entropy, sliced through the adamantium hulls of Imperial frigates, causing them to decay into dust. Torpedoes laden with screaming ghosts and flesh-eating viruses were launched into the packed ranks of the Crusade fleet. The battle became a maelstrom of unimaginable violence, a chaotic vortex of light and death around the ghastly spire. Imperial ships, crippled and dying, made suicide runs, ramming their tormentors and detonating their plasma drives in final acts of defiance. The Knights launched their planetary assault craft not at a planet, but directly at the Agony Spire itself. Landers, braving a storm of defensive fire that turned space into a solid wall of energy, slammed into the spire's fleshy, bone-plated surface. From their breached hulls stormed the Knights of the Ashen Stars, their once proud heraldry painted over with stark black and gray, symbols of their penance. They landed on gantries slick with blood, on platforms made of screaming, living faces, on balconies overlooking pits where souls were being flensed from bodies. They were steel behemoths in a charnel house, their heavy stomps crushing Cabalite warriors, their thermal cannons melting grotesque homunculi constructs into bubbling sludge. They were hopelessly outnumbered. For every Drukhari they killed, 10 more seemed to materialize from shimmering portals or descend on bladed skimmers. But the Knights fought with a strength that was not born of tactics or discipline, but of pure, unadulterated self-hatred. Every kill was an act of penance, every drop of Xenos blood a futile attempt to wash the stain from their own souls. They were not fighting to live, they were fighting to die, and to drag as much of this nightmare down with them as they possibly could. They pushed relentlessly inward and upward, towards the spire's pinnacle, where Archon Vresk Malidrach watched the glorious, unexpected battle unfold from his throne, a connoisseur's smile playing on his lips. He had planned a harvest, but the universe, in its delightful cruelty, had decided to serve him a banquet of glorious, despair-fueled war as an aperitif. The assault on the Agony Spire was less a battle and more the death throes of a leviathan. House Hyperion, consumed by a singular self-destructive purpose, tore at the heart of the Drukhari operation with the fury of the damned. Fleets clashed and died in the void, but the true focus of the war was the spire itself, a vertical battlefield hundreds of kilometers high. The Knights, fighting through corridors of living flesh and plazas paved with tormented faces, carved a path of ruin upwards, their every volley a prayer of hatred, their every step an act of contrition. High King Erator the Valiant was at the apex of this charge. He had forsaken the throne of the Gloriana Invictus, taking his place once more in the cockpit of the Fist of Retribution. His Knight Castellan was a behemoth of focused rage, its hull already scarred and pitted from the brutal boarding action. He and his personal lance, the last surviving barons of his inner circle, formed a spearhead of adamantium and fire, their goal nothing less than the spire's command pinnacle, the sanctum of the architect of their fall. They fought their way through horrors that would have shattered the sanity of lesser men. They witnessed soul engines powered by the liquefied agony of a billion minds, saw homunculi fleshcrafters assembling armies of shrieking grotesques from living prisoners, and battled witches who moved with a grace so fluid it was beautiful, right up until their poison-laced blades found a weak point in a knight's armor seals. Aerator's companions fell one by one, their magnificent machines brought down by overwhelming numbers or the esoteric, soul-destroying weaponry of the Drukhari elite. One was toppled into a vat of acidic bile, its reactor core detonating and taking a swath of the spire with it. Another was ensnared by barbed, living chains and literally torn apart piece by piece, its pilot's screams broadcast on an open channel as a form of psychological warfare. Finally, only Erator was left. He breached the final gate to the spire's zenith, the obsidian antechamber, a vast opulent hall whose crystalline ceiling showed the swirling, chaotic naval battle outside. At the center of the hall, upon a throne carved from the petrified skeletons of 1,000 psychers, sat Archon Vresk Malidrach. He was a vision of decadent cruelty, his armor a polished mosaic of captured soul stones, his face a perfect surgically crafted mask of aristocratic contempt. He was flanked by his personal guard, the Incubi, silent, horned warriors clad in blood-red armor, their hands resting on the hilts of their claves. The High King of the Witless Shepherds, Maladrak's voice was a silken, mocking whisper, amplified by the hall's strange acoustics. How wonderfully, exquisitely tragic. You have come to enact some petty vengeance, I presume, to salvage some scrap of your so-called honor. You should be thanking me. I gave your pointless existence a grand purpose. I made you the stars of the greatest tragedy this sector has ever known. I have not come for honor. Arator's voice boomed from the Castellan's external vox, a sound of grinding metal in broken worlds. Honor is a luxury for those who are not already damned. I have come for you. The fist of retribution raised its volcano cannon. Before it could fire, the incubi moved. They were a blur of red and black, impossibly fast, their claves glowing with malevolent power. They swarmed the knight's legs, their blades striking with enough focused force to gouge deep wounds in the adamantium plate, seeking to sever actuator cables and cripple the war machine. Arator ignored them. They were insects. His gaze, through his multi-lens display, was locked on the Archon. He unleashed the full fury of his knight's arsenal, not at Maladrak, but at the throne itself. The plasma decimator fired, a wave of star-hot energy that vaporized the incubi foolish enough to be caught in its path. The shield-breaker missiles and Gatling cannons raked the chamber, shattering the obscene statuary and turning the Archon's honor guard into clouds of red mist. Maladrak, with a bored sigh, shimmered and vanished, a flicker of a personal shadow field. He reappeared on the other side of the chamber, a splinter pistol in his hand, which he fired contemptuously at the knight's cockpit. The shot was useless, but the insult was clear. Arator knew he could not win a ranged battle against an opponent so unnaturally swift. He charged. The Knight Castellan, a machine weighing over 100 tons, thundered across the polished floor, its iron tread shattering the delicate mosaic. Maladrak watched him come, a slight, amused smile on his lips. This was the moment he had craved, the ultimate despair of a mighty king reduced to a charging, mindless beast. Just as the knight was about to crush him, Maladrak activated the hall's final hidden defense. Lines of dark energy flared to life on the floor, converging on the Knight Castellan. It was a stasis field, a trap of temporal energy that seized the mighty war engine, slowing its charge to a crawl. The machine groaned, its engines screaming as they fought against the bonds of frozen time, but it was held fast. A predictable, brutish end, Maladrak sneered, walking leisurely towards the trapped knight. Your rage was your strength, and now it is your cage. I will enjoy peeling the soul from your broken body, King Arator. Your agony will be the centerpiece of my collection. But Arator had one final desperate gambit. He had not come for his own survival. He had come for mutual annihilation. Trapped and helpless, he did the unthinkable. He overloaded his knight's twin plasma cores, bypassing every safety protocol and failsafe. The play is over, Xenos. Arator's final transmission was a grim whisper of static. And I am bringing down the curtain. Maladrak's eyes widened in genuine surprise, his amusement turning to alarm. He saw the light, building within the knight's chest, the angry stellar glow of its imminent catastrophic detonation. He turned to flee, but it was too late. The fist of retribution detonated. It was not an explosion. It was the birth of a temporary sun in the heart of the agony spire. A wave of pure, white-hot plasma and raw energy erupted outwards, instantly incinerating Archon Vresk, Maladrak, his incubi, and the entire command pinnacle. The death of the king was the death of the Archon. The final act of penance was paid in the currency of atomic fire. Arator the Valiant's legend ended not with a heroic victory, but in a final cleansing act of suicidal, vengeful self-destruction. The death of Archon Vresk Maladrak was not a silent, localized event. The plasma detonation that consumed him and High King Arator was merely the physical manifestation of a far greater, more catastrophic death. The Archon was not just a commander, he was the psychic and political linchpin of the entire soul-harvesting operation. His will, amplified by the esoteric technologies of the Agony Spire, was the force that stabilized the massive raw webway portal at its base and directed the flow of stolen life energy into Camorra. When his life was so violently and abruptly extinguished, that control shattered. The psychic backlash was instantaneous and apocalyptic, a wave of pure negative emotional energy. The amplified death scream of the Archon combined with the agonizing resonance of 1 trillion tortured souls being suddenly and chaotically released, erupted from the spire's pinnacle. It was a shockwave of pure despair, a non-physical tsunami of torment that washed over the entire system. For the Drukhari, the effect was devastating. Their entire society is built upon a delicate, constant intake of suffering to stave off the slow consumption of their souls by the chaos god Slaanesh. This sudden, overwhelming, and uncontrolled blast of raw agony was not a feast, but a poison. Cabalite warriors on the spire clutched their heads, their minds shattered by the psychic feedback, their bodies dissolving into clouds of crystalline dust as She Who Thirsts claimed their unprotected souls in an instant. The pilots of their sleek warships screamed as their minds were flensed, their ships going dead in the void, spinning off into the darkness or crashing into their sister vessels. The homunculi in their laboratories exploded in showers of gore, their meticulously crafted bodies unable to contain the raw power of the psychic detonation. The entire Drukhari fleet and the Spire's vast population were lobotomized, their higher functions scoured away by a tidal wave of the very essence they sought to control. For the surviving knights of House Hyperion, the effect was different but no less terrible. Their minds, shielded by faith and the iron will of their training, were not instantly destroyed. Instead, they were subjected to the collective pain of every soul they had unwittingly condemned. They felt the terror of the Vespid, the despair of the Signians, and the grinding, hopeless agony of the Viridians all at once. It was a torment that transcended physical pain, a direct assault on their spirit. Princeps screamed in their command thrones, blood pouring from their eyes and ears, their minds permanently scarred by the echoes of their own crimes. Many suffered catastrophic strokes or simply went mad, their knights going berserk, lashing out at friend and foe alike before their reactors finally failed. The physical destruction followed the psychic one. With Maladrak's will gone, the systems regulating the flow of power through the agony spire failed. The stolen soul energy, no longer being funneled into the webway, began to feed back on itself. The spire, a construct of psychically resonant bone and flesh, began to overload. It glowed with a sickly emerald light, pulsing like a dying heart. Veins of energy raced across its surface, causing vast chunks of its structure to slough off into the void. And then, the webway portal at its base, no longer stable, collapsed. The implosion was an event on a stellar scale. It did not create an explosion in real space, but rather a vacuum, a wound that sucked everything into its swirling, non-Euclidean maw. The agony spire was the first to go, pulled apart and dragged into the collapsing tunnel between realities, its final death scream, a silent shriek of tearing space-time. The crippled and dead ships of the Drukhari fleet were drawn in next, vanishing into the vortex. The remnants of the Imperial fleet, battered and broken, were caught in the immense gravitational tide. The Gloriana Invictus, its ancient engines fighting against the pull, was dragged sideways, its port side sheared away as it scraped against the event horizon. Dozens of smaller cruisers and escorts were not so lucky, disappearing entirely into the maelstrom. When the portal finally sealed itself shut, with a final sickening crunch of reality folding in on itself, there was only silence. The agony spire was gone. The Drukhari fleet was gone. The vast triumphant armada of House Hyperion was reduced to a handful of crippled, drifting vessels, their hulls breached, their crews decimated, their spirits broken beyond repair. The Pyrrhic victory was complete. The soul harvest was ended, but the price was the near total annihilation of the knightly house. The shattered front was not a line on a map, but a gaping wound in the soul of every survivor, a silent, drifting graveyard orbiting a star that now seemed to shine with a colder, more malevolent light. The aftermath of the agony spire's implosion was not a clean silence, but the resonant, cloying quiet of a tomb. The handful of surviving ships from House Hyperion's fleet drifted aimlessly, their systems flickering, their hulls weeping atmosphere into the void. But the physical destruction, catastrophic as it was, paled in comparison to the metaphysical wound that had been torn in the fabric of the Somnus stars. The uncontrolled psychic detonation from the spire was more than just a shockwave. It was a beacon. The raw, undiluted agony of 1 trillion souls released in a single, chaotic instant did not simply dissipate. It saturated the entire sector, staining the very essence of reality with the memory of torment. It was a psychic chum, slick of exquisite despair, an irresistible lure for the predators that swim in the deepest, darkest currents of the immaterium. The veil between realities, already stressed and thin from decades of brutal warfare, now shredded like wet parchment. The effect was not immediate or uniform. It began as whispers in the dark, as unsettling flickers in the corner of one's vision. On the bridge of the crippled Gloriana Invictus, surviving crewmen would see fleeting images of the Viridian dead in the polished deck plates. Astropaths, their minds already scoured by the backlash, babbled of a great eye-opening, of a hungry, laughing darkness. The first physical manifestation occurred on the war-torn surface of Viridia Prime. In the ruins of Acropolis Majoris, where the suffering had been most concentrated, a fog began to form. It was not a natural mist, but a swirling, oily vapor that shimmered with unnatural colors and whispered with the voices of the dead. From this fog, things began to take shape. Demons, drawn by the psychic banquet, clawed their way into real space. Hordes of chittering nurglings, born from the lingering despair and disease of the long war, capered through the ruins. Slaneshi demonettes, their forms sinuous and alluringly horrific, danced across the blasted plains, their laughter the echo of the Drukhari's cruelty. Bloodletters of corn, drawn by the sheer, unadulterated violence of the Crusade, materialized in phalanxes, their hellblades glowing with incandescent rage. This was not a full-scale demonic incursion in the classical sense, with a stable warp rift and a clear objective. It was something more insidious, more terrifying. The Somnus Stars had become a haunted house on a sectorial scale. The veil had thinned to a horrifying degree, allowing the Empyrean and real space to bleed into one another. Worlds that had been scoured of life became hunting grounds for demonic entities. The ghosts of the slain, their souls unable to find peace, became prey for psychic parasites and hosts for incorporeal entities. Aboard the surviving Imperial ships, the horror was more intimate. Strange geometric patterns of frost would appear on bulkheads. Crew members would be found driven mad, having scrawled frantic, spiraling patterns on the walls with their own blood. The Geller fields, designed to protect ships in the warp, began to flicker and fail even in real space, allowing demonic incursions to occur in the very heart of their vessels. The Gloriana Invictus, a venerable relic of the Great Crusade, became a haunted labyrinth. Entire decks had to be sealed off as packs of warp beasts manifested in the corridors, hunting the few remaining crew. The ship's machine spirit, once noble and resolute, seemed to become sullen and malevolent, its cogitators returning results filled with numerological blasphemies. The psychic death scream of the Agony Spire had done more than just end the Drukhari threat. It had fundamentally and permanently changed the nature of the Somnus Stars. It was no longer merely a graveyard of forgotten empires and fallen worlds. It was a wound in the galaxy, a place where the laws of physics were suggestions, and the barrier between the material and the immaterial was a faded, tattered memory. It had become a weeping veil, a sector-wide ghost story, where the air itself was thick with the sorrow of the past and the lurking promise of damnation. The victory over the Drukhari had been absolute, but in their final desperate act, House Hyperion had not cleansed the sector. They had cursed it, turning their monument of shame into a festering gateway to hell. In the chaotic days following the destruction of the Agony Spire, what remained of House Hyperion teetered on the brink of utter dissolution. Of the hundreds of knights who had embarked on the Gilded Quest, fewer than 50 remained operational. Of a fleet of over 100 warships, only a dozen were capable of warp travel, and even those were heavily damaged, their crews reduced to skeletal remnants haunted by what they had endured. The chain of command was shattered. The High King was dead, his entire royal court annihilated. The barons were gone, their lances wiped out in the suicidal charge. Leadership, by right of survival and clarity of mind, fell to Lady Elysia. She had survived the psychic backlash, her analytical, ordered mind proving to be a stronger shield against the tide of emotional horror than the faith-fueled fury that had consumed so many of her peers. She found herself the de facto High Queen of a kingdom of ashes, her throne the battered command deck of the Gloriana Invictus, her subjects the broken, shell-shocked survivors of a house that had effectively ceased to exist. Her first commands were not of war, but of survival. She ordered the fleet to consolidate, to abandon the most heavily damaged vessels, and transfer all remaining crew and resources to the Invictus and a handful of escort cruisers. The task was grim. They moved through the silent, drifting hulks of their own fleet, salvaging what they could, the light of their shuttles illuminating the frozen, vacuum-bloomed corpses of their former comrades. It was a week-long funeral dirge conducted in the cold silence of the void. During this period of consolidation, the debate over their future raged among the surviving princeps. Some argued for an immediate retreat, to flee the cursed Somnus stars and return to the Imperium to warn them of what had transpired. They argued that their duty was done, their vengeance enacted, and that to remain was suicide. Others, driven mad by grief and shame, argued for a final, glorious charge into the heart of the sector's growing demonic infestation, to die in a blaze of futile, cleansing fire. Lady Elysia listened to all of them, her face a stoic mask that concealed her own profound grief. When all had had their say, she rendered her judgment, her voice quiet, but imbued with an authority forged in the crucible of their shared damnation. "We cannot leave," she stated, her words silencing the fractious council. To flee would be the final, unforgivable act of cowardice. We were the architects of this hell. The blood of this sector is on our hands. The demons that now feast here were summoned by the echo of our sins. To abandon this place to the fate we created would be to prove Archon Meladrak right, that we are nothing but witless shepherds who run when the wolves they invited into the fold finally appear. She looked from one haunted face to the next. "And we cannot seek a glorious death. There is no glory left for us. We squandered it on a lie. Death is too easy an escape from the duty we now bear." She walked to the great hololith at the center of the command deck and with a sweep of her hand brought up an image of the Somnus stars. Red runes, indicating warp phenomena, and demonic incursions were blooming across it like a plague. "Our Gilded Quest is over. Our penitent turn has ended in this ruin. Now a new and final oath must be sworn. We are the wardens of this tomb. We are the jailers of the ghosts we have made. We will remain here in the heart of the weeping vale, and we will fight. We will not fight for victory, for there is none to be had. We will not fight for redemption, for we are beyond it. We will fight a war of containment. We will be the iron wall that prevents the horrors of this place from spreading to the wider galaxy. It is our penance, Eivor, and it will be eternal." There was no cheer, no roar of assent. There was only a slow, grim nodding of heads. Her words resonated with the terrible truth they all felt in their souls. They were cursed, and this sector was their prison. The first act of this new, hopeless crusade was the symbolic repainting of their heraldry. The vibrant golds, cobalts, and crimsons of House Hyperion were sandblasted from the hulls of their knights and their ships. In their place, they painted a stark, solemn livery of slate gray and ash black. They erased their old house sigil, replacing it with a single weeping star. They were no longer House Hyperion, a name now synonymous with tragedy and unwitting evil. From that day forward, they would be known only as the Knights of the Ashen Stars. Their consolidation became a scouring. They moved from system to system, not as conquerors, but as exterminators. They hunted the demonic warbands that roamed the empty worlds, their knights becoming grim specters of vengeance. They established a permanent patrol, a lonely, endless vigil around the most unstable regions of the sector. They became a myth, a ghost story whispered by the few rogue traders who dared to skirt the edges of the Somnus stars. Tales of silent, gray-painted knights who would emerge from the nebulae to obliterate any vessel, imperial or otherwise, that ventured too deep, enforcing a quarantine of death. Their war had no end goal, no hope of reinforcement, no promise of a final victory. It was an oath to stand guard over their own monumental failure, a penitent crusade that would only end when the last night fell and their long, self-imposed damnation was finally complete. Centuries passed, the Imperium, in its vast and grinding indifference, all but forgot the Somnus stars. Navigational charts were updated with stark, simple warnings. Sector maledicta, forbidden, unnavigable. Rumors and fragmented reports would occasionally filter out to the nearby segmentum commands. Tales from terrified merchant captains who had strayed too close and spoken of a sector haunted by both demons and grim, silent giants of iron. The Ordo Malleus took note, quarantining the region with orbital warning beacons and long-range patrol squadrons, content to let the festering wound remain so long as its infection did not spread. Within this sealed tomb, the legacy of House Hyperion played out its final tragic act. The Knights of the Ashen Stars held their eternal vigil, under the stoic, ageless leadership of Lady Elysia, whose life was extended by grim Mechanicus Augmetics. They became a self-sufficient monastic order of warriors. They cannibalized their own dead ships to keep the Gloriana Invictus and their few remaining escorts operational. They forsook all notions of noble lineage and house politics. New princeps were chosen from the handful of children born in the void, raised in a culture of ceaseless penance, taught from birth that their only purpose was to pay for the sins of their ancestors. Their war was a slow, grinding attrition against the impossible. They could not defeat the demonic tide, for it was a force of nature born from their own actions. They could only manage it. They would learn to predict where the veil was thinnest, where the incursions would be strongest, and they would be there to meet them. Lances of gray-painted knights would make planetfall on worlds where the whispers of the warp grew too loud, their battle cannons and thermal cannons scouring the land of demonic filth before retreating back to the cold safety of their fleet. It was a war fought in silence and shadow, with no one to witness their deeds, no one to record their hopeless, unending battle. The name of House Hyperion itself became a curse. Across the Segmentum Tempestus, inquisitors and historians who pieced together the fragmented story of the Gilded Quest came to a grim conclusion. The official record, classified at the highest levels, listed the entire house as excommunicate traitorous. They were not remembered as heroes who were tragically deceived, but as fools who, through pride and arrogance, became the architects of a sector-wide damnation. Their verdant homeworld of Hyperia was eventually subsumed by a neighboring, more powerful imperial fiefdom, its people absorbed and its history slowly erased, the shame of their fallen lords too great a stain to be remembered. The ultimate legacy of the Gilded Quest was not one of glory or even of tragedy, but of a permanent festering wound in the fabric of the galaxy. The Somnus stars, now forever known as the Weeping Veil, became a permanent fixture of the galactic map of horrors, a place where reality was thin and the ghosts of 1 trillion murdered souls screamed into the void. It was a monument to the grim truth of the 41st millennium, that the greatest of evils are often born from the noblest of intentions. The knights' desire for honor, their unshakable faith, their quest for glory, these were the very tools the enemy had used to orchestrate their downfall and the damnation of countless billions. The story of the Knights of the Ashen Stars never truly ended, because their penance was eternal, even into the dark days of the Noctis Eterna. As the great rift tore the galaxy in two, their vigil continued. They were a fading echo of a fallen house, their numbers dwindling with each passing century, their machines failing, their last generation of warriors knowing nothing but the grim, hopeless war inside their self-imposed prison. They became a legend of damnation, a cautionary tale whispered in the halls of other knightly houses, a stark reminder that the path to hell is paved not with malice but with the arrogant certainty of the righteous. Their final, enduring legacy was a legacy of ash, the ashes of the worlds they had burned, the ashes of their own honor, and the cold, dead ash of a hope that had died centuries before in a forgotten, haunted corner of the endless, uncaring galaxy.